The very first Starlink V2 satellites built by SpaceX have been spotted at Starbase. It was observed that SpaceX was loading some of the first Starlink V2 satellite prototypes into a specialized mechanism that was designed to replenish the payload bay that resembled a magazine on Starship. The photographs that were taken by Kevin Randolph are the first ones that unmistakably show real prototypes of the next generation of Starlink satellites. Welcome to Techmo. In today's video, we're going to talk about the latest news regarding SpaceX's first Starlink V2 satellites. On Monday, SpaceX was seen putting some of the first Starlink V2 satellite prototypes into a special device made to fill the payload bay of the Starship. Though SpaceX has used the dispenser before, photographer Kevin Randolph's images are the first to unmistakably reveal actual prototypes of the upcoming Starlink satellites. These Starlink Gen 2 or V2 satellites will be at least 5 times better, an order of magnitude more capable, and roughly 4 times heavier than existing V1.5 Starlink satellites, according to CEO Elon Musk. The new satellite bus design has the potential to significantly increase the viability and cost-effectiveness of SpaceX's Starlink constellation when combined with Starship's enormous fairing and lift capacity. However, the business must first launch and qualify models of the new satellite design and ensure that all related ground support machinery functions as intended. The ground support hardware and the general path each satellite will take from its arrival at the launch facilities to liftoff on a Starship are wildly different from anything done before, due to the design SpaceX has chosen for both Starlink V2.0 satellites and the Starship hardware that will deploy them in orbit. The images from July 18th, as well as screenshots from a recent factory tour, demonstrate that the new satellites are essentially enlarged versions of their smaller predecessors, which are also narrow rectangles. The new spacecraft is about 7 meters long and 3 meters wide, instead of roughly 3 meters by 1.5 meters, but it has a very similar aspect ratio. They reportedly weigh 1,250 kilograms compared to the V1.5's estimated 310 kilograms, and they also seem to be about twice as thick. The V2.0 bus will therefore have roughly 7 to 10 times more usable volume than the V1.0 and V1.5 buses. The fact that each new satellite could provide almost a magnitude more usable bandwidth shouldn't come as a surprise. Starlink V2.0 constellation deployment would be at least twice as cost-effective to execute even if Starship could only launch the same mass as Falcon 9. Assuming that Starship launch costs are roughly the same as Falcon 9's and that Starship can only launch a similar 50 to 60 satellites at once, an almost tenfold performance improvement from a satellite that only weighs 5 times as much relative to V1.5 would make Starlink V.2 constellation deployment. In fact, according to a recent SpaceX render, Starship will initially be able to transport 54 Starlink V2.0 satellites. Therefore, even though Starship will cost about $75 million to launch, 5 times more than Falcon 9, it will still be less expensive per unit of bandwidth launched. The cost of Starlink launches, excluding satellite costs, could decrease from approximately $15,000 per gigabit per second to around $1,500 to $2,500 per gigabit per second, depending on individual satellite bandwidth, if Starship eventually reaches marginal launch costs as low as Falcon 9, which is $15 million. The network's overall cost will be higher and based on more factors, but the combination of Starship and V2.0 satellites may eventually result in a 5 to 10-fold decrease in the relative cost of Starlink launch operations. These savings will grow if Starlink V2.0 satellites are actually less expensive to produce than V1.5 satellites per unit of throughput once mass production starts, which is not improbable. The equation might even turn out to be more advantageous if Starship can develop quickly and become completely and effectively reusable. Although it won't be a simple task, loading Starship with satellites will increase complexity and risk significantly compared to the procedures SpaceX currently employs for Falcon 9 Starlink launches. The initial SpaceX Starship payload bay design is a roughly square enclosure that fits just below the ship's inwardly curved nose cone and above its uppermost tank dome. It can store up to 54 Starlink V2.0 satellites and can dispense pairs of satellites through a relatively narrow payload bay door that is only wide enough for the task at hand. according to a render of the mechanism released that month. The mechanism is about 9 meters tall and 8 meters wide. The airframe of a Starship is almost entirely welded together. The dispenser door, or a still smaller human-sized access port, are the only ways to enter the payload bay once the nose cone and payload bay have been mounted on top of a ship. The solution proposed by SpaceX is to construct a mobile satellite storage container that can be raised several hundred to thousands of feet above the ground using a crane or launch tower arms, and to load satellites into the container in reverse using the payload bay's own dispenser mechanism. It's not simple, even though it shouldn't sound that way. The fact that SpaceX appears to have used some of the initial Starlink V2.0 prototypes to practice that procedure is fantastic. Several satellites were seen being loaded into the Soul loader inside one of Starbase's 3 main factory tents in pictures taken on July 18th. The extremely long and thin satellites were lifted using a load spreader device, which was likely necessary to prevent them from bending too much in the middle during the lift. It's unclear if SpaceX is actually installing satellites far in advance for loading onto a Starship prototype, or if it's just practicing the procedure. I predicted in August of 2021 that SpaceX would once more attempt to optimize the new Starlink V2.0 satellite design to take full advantage of Starship's launch capabilities, just as it did with Falcon 9. A version of the constellation designed for Starship would be built, so that the rocket could launch an entire orbital plane, one ring of satellites, spaced evenly around the Earth, in a single shot. The company conveniently revealed in an updated Starlink Gen 2 filing. It was safe to assume that SpaceX meant that each Starship would nominally carry 110 to 120 satellites, because in that constellation variant, all but 500, which is 1.5% of almost 30,000 spacecraft, would be stationed in planes of 110 or 120 satellites. A Starship-optimized Starlink V2.0 is all but guaranteed to operate using MUSK's most upbeat estimate of 150 tons to low Earth orbit. The satellite loader has already greeted Starship S-24 once, possibly to load a prototype or mock-up before ground testing started, while it is currently undergoing pre-flight testing. Starship S-25's nose and payload bay section are much closer to completion than the rest of the ship, which appears to be at least a month or 2 away. In spite of these significant benefits, SpaceX's Starlink Gen 2 goals still leave it with absolutely no wiggle room whatsoever. If the FCC grants SpaceX's request for a license, the company would have 6 years to launch 50% of the constellation, which would amount to approximately 130 Starship launches or 22 launches per year. Falcon 9, a rocket that was first put into flight in 2010 and is 10 times smaller and less reusable than its predecessor, was able to complete 22 launches in a single year, not until 2020. In order for SpaceX's Starship to have any chance of meeting the cadence requirements of Starlink Gen 2, the company would need to accelerate the launches of the largest rocket that has ever been constructed at a truly miraculous rate, while simultaneously suffering an extremely low number of malfunctions or other types of setbacks along the way. It's safe to assume that Starlink Gen 2 could serve tens or even hundreds of millions of users located anywhere on Earth if SpaceX is able to build it. Starlink will always be constrained by the number of satellites that can be simultaneously available over any one point on Earth, so the constellation will never be able to match a ground network 1-to-1 ratio with the same install capacity. So that's all for today's video. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to watch more videos like this one, hit the subscribe button and turn on the notifications so that you'll always be notified.